All right, welcome back to my live reading of Book 2, Chapter 7 and Chapter 8 of the reading of the history of ancient America anterior to the time of Columbus, proving the identity of the Aborigines with the Tyrians and Israelites by George Jones, written between the dates of 1810 and 1879. And remember, this book discusses the differences between the Mexican Aborigines and the North and Southeast Coast Aborigines, pointing out the religious worship practices and rituals of the Mexican Aborigines and their sun worship of their sun god and the demon of blood, which was the sacrifice of their own children. Now, if you are just coming in for the very first time, please take the time to view my past video called The Reclassification of the North and Southeast Coast Amerindian, taped as a live stream because it is the beginning read for the books and the chapters I've already read. This is a credible source located via the Library of Congress. Let's move forward. Chapter 7, 585 through 515 BC. Ithobalus II to Sissinus. The first siege of Tyrus and fulfillment of the prophecy by Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and of the first and second prophecy by Isaiah. During the war upon Egypt by the king of Babylon, and which occurred only 7 years after the voyage around Africa, it is probable that the king of Tyrus would assist Pharaoh Necho against the invasion of the Nile by Nebuchadnezzar, the attack by Pharaoh at the solicitation of Judea, Ezekiel 18 and 15. Which nation was still paying the annual tribute to Egypt had compelled the Babylonian to raise the siege of Jerusalem. In this moment also, the Tyrians may have aided by countenance or wealth. In these apparent probabilities, we find the political cause why Nebuchadnezzar turned his fury upon Tyrus after his conquest of Egypt, and his second and successful invasion of Judea and the captivity of the Jews, which latter event took place 588 BC. The fall of Judea gave the monopolizing and pride-stricken Tyrians great cause for rejoicing, not from malice against the afflicted people, but because their own trading propensities would be increased, as it would, in their minds, by the downfall of any aspiring nation. A few years before, they had witnessed the conquest of Egypt and now of Judea, both of which were causes of peculiar joy to the Tyrians, for those nations had latent sparks within them, from which these fire of science might be created and so illume their own path towards the attainment of navigation, and thence rest upon their own exertions for a commercial prosperity. Jerusalem had evinced the spirit as easy as the time of Solomon, and also Egypt, only 7 years before her present downfall. This was the point causing the national rejoicing of Tyrus. It was a commercial gladness, thence, with them, a political one. Less rejoicing, or its entire absence, would have been, quote, love of neighbor, unquote, and which, when it affected their interests, the Tyrians never had extended joy, as if Jerusalem had fallen for the express purpose of their own prosperity, and so sanctioned by their gods, became blasphemy. They evinced this impiety to its full extent. Therefore, the king of Babylon, in resenting his own wrongs, was but an instrument of retribution in the hand of God to punish those who in savage triumph rejoiced at the chastening and captivity of a neighbor nation. Ezekiel thus describes the religious cause why Tyrus, in her want of charity to a fallen neighbor, should become desolate. 26. He prophesies 588 BC, quote, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, because that Tyrus hath said against Jerusalem, Aha, she is broken. That was the gates of the people. She is turned unto me. I shall be replenished. Now she is laid waste. Unquote. The prince of Tyrus also uttered this blasphemy in his triumph. Quote, I am God. I sit in the seat of God. Unquote. 28. Quote, therefore, unquote, continues Ezekiel, quote, "Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Tyrus, and will cause many nations to come up against thee, as the sea causeth his waves to come up. And they shall destroy the walls of Tyrus, and break down her towers. I will scrape her dust from her, and make her like the top of a rock. It shall be a place for the spreading of nets in the midst of the sea." How truly fulfilled. "For I have spoken it, said the Lord God, and it shall become a spoil to the nations, and her daughters which are in the field shall be slain with the sword. And they shall know that I am the Lord. For thus said the Lord God, Behold, I will bring upon Tyrus Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, a king of kings from the north, with horses and with chariots, and with horsemen and companies and much people." Unquote. Foretold by the first lawgiver nearly 9 centuries before. The Tyrians, through the means of their shipping, continually supplied the capital with provisions. Thence the duration of the siege, and Nebuchadnezzar had not the genius of the subsequent and final conqueror of Tyrus, the heroic Macedonian. The Babylonian had therefore to erect his forts and mounds, and with his engines of war made a breach into the mainland city. During the several years, thousands were slain on either side. Those of the Tyrians were replaced by her wise men of the ocean, her pilots and mariners, and as they left their vessels for the metropolis, the galleys were sunk at sea to prevent their falling into the enemy's hands, and thereby enable them to turn upon the island, the only place of Tyrian retreat. After a siege of 13 years and more than three-quarters of the male population destroyed, breaches were made in the walls, for men were no longer there to defend them. The metropolis was entered by the foe, and every part destroyed. Temples, palaces, and houses laid in ashes were razed to the ground, and the inhabitants slain, excepting those that had fled to the island. These consisted principally of women and children, and to the rescue of the great proportion of the former, and thus preventing rapine and slaughter by the besiegers, may reasonably be attributed the cause of the rapid increase of the Tyrian population upon the island, and which has always confounded writers upon this siege, and led some to doubt the fulfillment of the prophecy. The Babylonian could not reach these fugitives for the reason stated, viz., the want of navigable means, and besides, the metropolis was destroyed, and that was his intent, and that accomplished, he would be willing to receive a tributary capitulation from the islanders. In the course of the siege, the king of Tyrus died, and also the prince. These deaths were prophesied by Ezekiel. The Tyrian monarch was succeeded by Baal, a branch of the royal house. Nebuchadnezzar, finding that the island could not be subdued, 572 BC, offered terms to Baal, They were accepted, and Baal was appointed his tributary viceroy and remained the vassal king of Tyrus for 10 years and died 562 BC. The shadowy dignity of viceroy was then abolished, and magistrates were appointed to administer justice and preside over the affairs of state. These magisterial government continued only for 6 years when it was abolished, and the sovereignty restored in the person of Balator, but still depending on the Assyrian monarch for all power and authority. 556 BC. This vassalage of the Tyrians were was correction. This vassalage of the Tyrians was continued to the time of Sisinus and correction, regal governor of Phoenicia, who, by the command of Darius, king of Babylon, assisted by the Tyrians, materially aided in building the second temple of Jerusalem. Upon the restoration of the house of Judah, and in the same spirit as Hiram the Great aided Solomon, king of Israel. 515 BC. The second temple was finished and dedicated in the year 515 before Christ. Now, taking the prophecy of Isaiah to commence at the beginning of the siege of Tyrus, for Tyrus had then ceased to be free, in other words, as a nation, which was in 585 BC. The quote 70 years unquote will be exactly accomplished at the dedication of the second temple. Thus were the first and second prophecies by Isaiah fulfilled, viz., the fall and subsequent freedom, for the destruction did take place, and at the termination of quote 70 years, unquote, the Lord of mercy did quote visit Tyrus, unquote, and made her again a nation, for her scorn and boast upon the destruction of Jerusalem had been forgotten and forgiven, and her stretching forth her hand again to aid the building of the sacred temple to the one and only God. As an instance of divine justice, it may be observed that the freedom of Tyrus did not take place before the restoration of Judea, and that the former nation had to endure the remorse of knowing that the latter, from her new throne of liberty, could behold the manacles of thraldom upon that country, which in prosperity has shouted in impious triumph upon her desolation. That will conclude the reading of chapter 7. I will now begin to read chapter 8 of book 2. 515 through 335 BC, Sisinus to Strato. And from the first Tyrian revolution to Azamek, at the termination of the siege by Nebuchadnezzar, we have stated that the remaining Tyrians fled to the island, opposite to the ancient metropolis destroyed by the Babylonian. The inhabitants never rebuilt the capital upon the ruins on the mainland, but upon the island which had received and sheltered them. They had, for the last half century, turned all their attention. This was now renewed with redoubled energy. Upon it, they erected their new and in time gorgeous temples, especially that dedicated to Hercules. Apollo, the tutelary god of the Tyrians, they also surrounded the island with a seawall, 150 feet in height and of proportionate thickness, and from there being no approach to it but by water. The new metropolis was considered impregnable. Upon the mainland, they erected many buildings of a minor character, such as are usually found in the environs of a city, and a great proportion of the laboring classes dwelt there, as also the strangers visiting Tyrus in pursuit of traffic or merchandise. Many years were employed in bringing the island capital to a state of complete defense, owing to the diminished numbers of the male population immediately after the siege. Tyrus must now be viewed as only on the island, which was about 800 yards from the shore, somewhat less than half a mile. Please look at the map for the distance between Africa and the Canary Islands. There's not a huge uh, distance between the two, and this book is pointing this out. So the next time you pick up a map, look at Africa, western part of Africa, and the Canary Islands, and you'll see that it's a very small distance. 800 yards is not a lot. From the time of Sissinus, the nation continued to increase in wealth and power. The former cause of her pride and glory, navigation, was revived with all the energy and perseverance for which their ancestors in the time of Hiram had been so justly renowned. As in her days of ancient fame, Tyrus had loaned and built fleets and navies for Israel and Egypt. She now did the same for the Persian monarch in his war upon Greece. A double motive caused this. Not only the pride of being able to furnish a navy, but her spirit of monopoly had again risen and begun to stalk abroad. For Greece had already aroused the jealousy of the Tyrians, and any means to crush or destroy the harbor of the Piraeus would advance their wishes. From the Persian, they could entertain no fears of commercial rivalry, for he had no river or port upon the Mediterranean. The honor of Tyrus as a nation, however, was shewn in refusing to loan or man a navy intended by a foreign king, who at first concealed his intent for carrying on a war against Carthage, and which denial led to the abandonment of the proposed warfare. It will be remembered that Carthage was originally founded by a Tyrian princess and her countrymen. The patriotism of the Tyrians was was as powerful as their knowledge of science was universal. For 35 years, Tyrus enjoyed the freedom of an independent nation when all Phoenicia was laid under contribution by the monarch of Persia. He was content, however, with a mere nominal tribute from the Tyrians in return for their aid against the Greeks, and perhaps from a distant belief that assistance might again be required. In furtherance of this design or policy, he did not depose the reigning king, but recognized in him the exercise of full powers, except the tribute, as a monarch of an independent nation. 480 BC. This nominal tribute was during the reign of Martin. The king and nobles were willing to flatter the vanity of the Persian by the nominal payment, for by his forbearance from any further action against the islanders, it enabled them to increase their power and retain their places both at home and abroad. They, therefore, could well afford to spare from their rich and overflowing treasury of pride so small a portion of a superfluity. Zechariah wrote, chapter 9, quote, "And Tyrus did build herself a stronghold, the island citadel, and heaped up silver at the dust and fine gold as the mire of the streets. But the pride was as subtle, quote, as broad and general as the casing air," unquote. It was in and around her. It was her nature to have been otherwise would have destroyed her identity and nationality. It was, however, upon one occasion exerted as a noble spirit and atoned for her errors past. It proved that freedom was not dead within the walls of Tyrus, and the now noble exertion of the only pride justifiable in any country, that of national freedom, led to the first and only revolution in the annals of the Tyrians in Asia. 475 BC. Justin states that it was an insurrection among the slaves. We do not presume to contradict the record of any historian, but will rather use every effort to support their statements by facts and evidence, as in the instance of Herodotus concerning the first voyage around Africa. But the record of Justin cannot be founded in truth so far as relates to the supposed class of human beings rising against their monarch and his council. Tyrus had no slaves in the usual acception of the word, for she had no foreign conquest, and her subjects were too proud to allow of any but themselves to pilot or man their galleys, either for merchandise or warfare. Nor would she allow foreigners to live within her walls, especially of the lower ranks of life, lest they should obtain the secret of shipbuilding and so convey intelligence to other nations bordering upon the Mediterranean. But ancient writers have generally viewed the tiers attack, or the third class of despotic empires and kingdoms, as slaves, and so have written of them. Even so, a period as half a year ago. The same was done in France till her revolution, although it moved in blood and tyranny, and brought to light human monsters. established that the people were to enjoy rights and liberties in analogy with those claimed and exercised by the islanders of Britain or their descendants in the Western Hemisphere. And if you have not joined me yesterday, if you were not with me, Britain is referring to the blacks, the Hebrew Israelites that started the country Great Britain, not the British or the Britain country of London as you know it today. The great national lesson was first taught the world by the rebellion of the patriot Jeroboam and the 10 tribes from the quote whip unquote and quote scorpion unquote son of Solomon. The rebellion of Jeroboam was but 500 years before this period, 475 BC, and from the great intercourse between the Judeans and Tyrians, the event must have been familiar to the latter and may have had its natural influence, therefore, in forwarding a similar action of their own. It is more than probable that the people disapproved of the payment of the nominal tribute, which was more degrading than any other, and made a remonstrance to the throne upon this subject. For their just pride had been aroused, and while they continued to pay to the Persian for mere political existence, they ceased to be a nation of free men. And Justin might consequently have written that all the Tyrians, king nobles, and people were slaves, for they were so while their golden manacles rattled and echoed along the distant shores of the Euphrates. Tyrus was also safe now from any attack by land, and by water the capital defied apparently both man and elements. The tribute had been originally imposed and levied upon the national witness. It was now to be thrown off in its day of strength. The king who would cowardly surrender and continue to submit a nation's liberty to a foreign yoke, while he had power to be free, and yet was willing to wear and hold the mere shadows of a crown and scepter, must have been at heart no fit guardian or steward of a people's honor or prosperity, and especially when in the very rank of the life, the rights of which he continued to betray. There was a spirit like the sun, ready to disperse the clouds lowering upon and obscuring his country's freedom. This Tyrian patriot was Strato, who, upon the successful issue of the rebellion and breaking of the foreign yoke imposed by Persia, was instantly elected sovereign. The royal title continued to his descendants, even to the last king of the Tyrians, 475 BC. From this time forward, Tyrus continued not only to enlarge her navigation, but to increase her inland commerce. One of the chief complaints made by the prophet Nehemiah against his countrymen was that their Sabbath was desecrated by buying merchandise of the Tyrians upon the holy day. Nehemiah caused the traffickers to be thrust out of Jerusalem more than once, and the gates to be closed upon them. But they still lingered around the walls in order to sell their commodities on the Jewish Sabbath, upon which the chief ruler of the restored house of Judah instantly threatened to have recourse to violence and drive the Tyrian merchants from their locality. This event, the 434 BC, was 41 years after the accession of the new dynasty. It was no sin in the estimation of the Tyrians to sail upon the Sabbath day of Israel, for they being heathens, they did not esteem that seventh day. Sounds familiar. The crime was that of buying by the Jews upon their own sacred Sabbath. In this manner is it justly reproved by Nehemiah. VIII, quote, there dwelt men of Tyrus also therein, in other words, in Jerusalem, which brought fish and all manner of ware, and sold on the Sabbath unto the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah and said unto them, what evil thing is this that ye do, and profane the Sabbath day? And it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates should be shut, and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants' guards set I at the gates, that there should be no burden brought in on this Sabbath day. So the merchants and sellers of all kinds of ware, in other words, the Tyrians, lodged without Jerusalem once or twice. Then I testified against them and said unto them, why lodge ye about the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands upon you. From that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath. Unquote. Jeremiah 13:16 through 21. Jerusalem is about 80 miles from Tyrus, and the merchants of the latter capital must have had communication with the former by land conveyance only, or they may have landed at Jaffa, as in the days of Hiram, and from thence by camel conveyance to Jerusalem. In either cases, the words of Nehemiah prove that Tyrians themselves were at the holy city as merchants and traders, and that consequently their commercial intercourse at that time was by land as well as by water with distant countries. The same spirited correction, the same spirit of monopoly which had actuated the early Tyrians was still professed and practiced by their descendants. But with Sidon, their parent, and Carthage, their daughter, were they on terms of friendship and reciprocity. 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 This continued throughout the following century. When the sympathy and gratitude of both nations were evinced upon the last solemn column Correction, upon the last solemn occasion of Tyrian nationality in Asia. With every other country, and especially with Rome, they betrayed their envy and growing jealousy. The incident related, Volume 1, Book 2, Chapter 3, in reference to the ingenious stratagem of the Tyrians in entrapping the Roman galley, whereby it and the crew were totally lost, while they themselves were saved, and the secret of their discovery secured, is but one of many proofs of the national character. This same feeling would naturally lead them to conceal from all foreign countries their previous discovery of the Fortunate Isles. They were their own, and none but the Tyrians knew of their locality, which knowledge gave them the means of finding a temporary resting place from the devastating effects of an approaching whirlwind. 335 BC, allowing 20 years as the average reign of the sovereigns, Alsamic, which, correction, Alsamic would be the eighth king in the present family, including Strato, the original founder of the last line of Tyrian monarchs. We now, we have now approached to the great national event, which led a portion of the Asiatic family to become the Aborigines of the southern or Mexican division of the Western Hemisphere. But, as we believe that the reader will have admitted that the Tyrians are identified as the original builders of the ruined edifices in America, and that this was sufficiently established in the first book of this volume. The chief circumstances then to be established are the time and means in which and whereby they reached the Western continent. And also, is it essentially required to prove a sufficient cause leading to these eventful incidents in a nation's history? In the following chapters, we believe that the veil of mystery woven even by the hands of the prophets will be raised from that creating cause, and by so doing, it will not only unfold time's romance in ancient America, but uphold the truth of prophecy and therefore of the past, explain the latest wonder of the present age. And we would fain indulge the hope that with the preceding pages and those to follow, not without some beneficial reflections for that of the future. That will conclude the reading of chapters 7 and chapter 8. I will conclude reading chapter 9 on another day. Please check your notifications for the remaining readings of the chapters. Thank you for joining me once again for another reading of this awesome book. Sometimes I get into tears while I'm reading. I am so glad to be able to share this book with you. And as I'm sharing it, we're learning together the connection between the Israelites and the African American today, their journey from wherever Africa is to their homeland. So wherever they were dispersed from to the Western Hemisphere, maybe it was from the east side of North America and heading to the west side. Only science and history knows, and studying of it helps us to determine and draw conclusions and be able to verbalize. That's the thing, being able to search for information, find it, read it, to conceptualize, internal it, meaning go from one ear to the other, not just hearing it and listening, but conceptualizing, using it in your memory to be able to verbalize it in a conversation after you've learned something. So hopefully this will be a book that you will always remember and share with others.